The reason you still want closure from them is because they trained you to believe they were the only person who could give it. And that is what makes emotionally inconsistent people so difficult to fully detach from. Not always because they were the deepest love of your life, not always because the relationship was uniquely powerful, but because the same person who created your confusion kept becoming the person you looked to for relief. That loop changes you. At first, it doesn't feel like damage. It feels like a connection with loose ends, a conversation that was never finished, a relationship that almost became something real. You tell yourself you just need one final honest talk, one mature explanation, one clean ending, one moment where they finally say exactly what happened and why. But if you're waiting for closure from someone whose entire pattern was inconsistency, distance, avoidance, and emotional half-presence, then what you're really waiting for is for an unstable source to suddenly become stable enough to soothe the wound they created. That's the trap. A lot of people think closure is a conversation. In reality, closure is often a pattern you finally stop negotiating with. Maybe they kept disappearing right after intimacy. Maybe they always came back when you were almost done. Maybe every serious conversation ended in emotional language, but never in clarity. Maybe they apologized without changing. Maybe they reassured you just enough to keep your hope alive, but never enough to make the relationship safe. And because there was always one more soft moment, one more vulnerable confession, one more almost explanation, your mind keeps treating the story like it is unfinished. But sometimes it feels unfinished because they kept it unfinished on purpose, not always in a cold, calculated way. Sometimes it comes from avoidance, sometimes from emotional immaturity, sometimes from unresolved attachment wounds. But whatever the reason, the effect is the same. Your nervous system stays open, waiting for resolution that never fully arrives. This is where trauma-bonded dynamics begin to form, when a person becomes both the source of your pain and the source of your temporary soothing. Your attachment can deepen even as your peace disappears. They hurt you, then comfort you. They confuse you, then reassure you. They withdraw, then return. So your body begins pairing their presence with relief, even though their behavior keeps destabilizing you. That's why leaving can feel less like freedom and more like withdrawal. You are not just grieving the person, you are grieving the fantasy that they will finally become coherent enough to repair what they broke. You're grieving the hope that one day the emotional pieces will line up and make the whole experience feel worth it. And this is why so many people keep chasing closure, long after they already know the truth. Because truth without emotional resolution can feel unbearable. Your mind says, I know this is unhealthy. But your attachment says, yes, but I still need them to explain it. Your logic says, the pattern already told me everything. But your nervous system says, I'll calm down when they come back one last time. That internal split is exhausting. And it's especially intense if you have an anxious attachment pattern. Because anxious attachment often wants repair through contact. It wants reassurance. It wants emotional clarity from the relationship itself. So when things end in confusion, you don't just lose the person. You lose the imagined future and the emotional answer you thought would help you regulate again. But here's the part that changes everything. Closure from inconsistent people is usually inconsistent too. Even if they come back to talk, the conversation often reflects the same pattern that hurt you. It's vague, half-clear, emotionally loaded but structurally empty. They say they care, but they still cannot give definition. They say you mattered, but they still avoid accountability. They express regret, but not in a way that rebuilds trust. So the conversation you thought would free you often reopens the emotional wound instead. Because you were looking for resolution from someone who never knew how to offer stability in the first place. Maybe you've lived this already. Maybe they sent the long message after weeks of silence. Maybe they admitted they were scared. Maybe they said they never meant to hurt you. Maybe they cried. Maybe they told you the connection was real. Maybe they even said part of what you needed to hear. And yet somehow, after the conversation, you still felt unsettled. Why? Because closure is not created by emotional intensity. It is created by reality becoming clear enough that your mind stops bargaining with fantasy. That is why the pattern matters more than the final speech. Did they repeatedly show up with consistency? Did they make you feel emotionally safe? Did they create clarity when things got difficult? Did they repair after harm in a way that changed the future? Or did they keep feeding the cycle with temporary softness and permanent ambiguity? Those answers are closure. Not always the closure you wanted, but often the closure you need. And no, this does not mean your longing is stupid. It doesn't mean your pain is dramatic. It means your system got attached to a person who represented both wound and relief. Of course detachment feels hard. Of course you want one final answer. Of course part of you still believes that if they could just explain it properly, the whole experience would stop hurting. But healing starts when you accept that some people are not capable of giving clean endings because they never gave clean presents. That sentence frees a lot. They may not be evil. They may not even be fully aware of what they did. They may genuinely care in the fragmented way they know how. But fragmented care still fragments the person receiving it. And if you keep waiting for them to become emotionally responsible enough to close the wound, you stay tied to the very dynamic that exhausted you. Real closure begins when you stop asking them to make the story make sense. Maybe the story makes sense already. They were inconsistent. You attached to the good moments. You endured the bad ones because the good ones kept interrupting the pain. You hoped the emotional depth would become relational maturity. It didn't. That is a complete story. Painful, yes. Unfair, yes. But complete. This is the power shift most people avoid because it feels colder than hope. You stop needing their explanation in order to trust your experience. You stop waiting for confession. You stop waiting for the perfect final conversation. You stop waiting for them to validate what the pattern already proved. And then, something changes. The silence stops looking like mystery. The inconsistency stops looking like complexity. The almost closure stops looking like a reason to stay emotionally available. You realize you were never missing information. You were missing acceptance. And once acceptance arrives, closure stops being something they owe you and becomes something you reclaim. You reclaim it by believing the repeated reality. You reclaim it by respecting the impact, not just the intention. You reclaim it by understanding that a person can have feelings for you and still be unsafe for your heart. You reclaim it by ending the negotiation between what happened and what you hoped would happen. Because closure is not always a final conversation. Sometimes closure is finally refusing to reopen the case.